Hey there, fellow anthropologists. It's Eric with another video. Today we're going to be talking about experimental archaeology, and specifically I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about flintknapping and experimental archaeology and some of the cool things that we can learn from experimentally replicating flintknapping and making stone tools. So I kind of outlined four things, at least in my mind, that I think are really beneficial from flintknapping. And mind you, if you're going to try flintknapping, I highly recommend you invest in some, gloves, some good, like rugged pair of jeans that you don't mind getting cut up, some piece of leather that you can wear on your top of your pants or lay on top of your pants, safety goggles, and first aid kit, because you might accidentally hurt yourself. I knew a guy who was a flint knapper and he lost the tip of his thumb while flint knapping. So it is dangerous. But there are a lot of things that we can learn from flint knapping. And the four things that I really saw, and I've even written them down right here just so I don't forget them. The four things that I thought were really useful in experimental archaeology, particularly with flint knapping, were that we can learn or sort of get into the minds of past flint knappers, but we can also learn about the formation process of the archaeological record. We can also make replicas for museum exhibits and for educational purposes. And we can also learn about the function of these artifacts and, potentially learn about things like ballistics and use-ware studies. So with that being said, I'm going to give you a few examples of experimentally replicated flint knapping stuff that I have just around my house. And we'll talk a little bit more about those in the next segment. All right, so here we have a few lithics that I've pulled out to talk about in today's episode, or lesson, I could say. And you'll notice that I've got some experimentally replicated projectile points. So, like I said, one of the things that we can start to get from experimental archaeology is to start to get into the minds of the flint knappers. So, one of the first things that archaeologists who did experimental flint knapping wanted to know is, how do we get this flute channel? And so archaeologist Donald Crabtree, back in, I believe it was the mid 20th century, started replicating fluted stone points to try and figure out how to make that flute. And if it wasn't for experimental archaeology, trial and error, we probably wouldn't know exactly how they were able to make these flute channels. Experimental archaeology allows us to start to get into the minds of flint knappers, so we can start to look at the things like the edge, and we can start to analyze, okay, well, this is a really well flaked edge versus a really poorly flaked edge. I mean, you can already tell the difference, if you know something about flint knapping between these three and this projectile point right here. I mean, this guy, for perspective, is one that I made. You might be able to see it a little bit better if I hold it up like that and get the glisten of the. This is actually made from a bottle. I actually made this on a live stream a few weeks ago, and I don't know if you can see the notching there at the end, but my flint knapping skills definitely pall in comparison to the flint knappers who made these objects. And we can see, things like the flake patterns on this. We can see the reflections, all these flake scars. So a lot of archaeologists, up until probably the mid 20th century, didn't have a good grasp on how stone tools were made. And that was mostly because they had never flint knapped before. So flint knapping allows us to start to get inside the minds of the prehistoric people who made stone tools, or even historic people who make stone tools. But as I talked about in the Brewerton video, when you make a stone tool like these, you oftentimes end up with a lot of waste materials. So think of it also when we talk about, a pencil. I talked about this in the Brewerton effect video, where when you make a pencil, the actual business end of the pencil gets shorter and shorter. Meanwhile, this part of the pencil doesn't change because it's always fixed in size. So this is going to get smaller relative to the size of this. So the ratio of the eraser holder to the length of the pencil is going to change as it gets used more and more. And as it gets used, you create pencil sharpener shavings. You end up with all the shavings of the pencil that you can sort of see right in here. Well, those shavings, the same thing is happening with stone tools. And so I've got a few examples here. They might be hard to see. And in fact, if we put this on a piece of white paper, you might be able to see these a little bit better. But we've got what we could call lithic debitage. And in fact, I chose specifically the book to put this on because this is a great example of a book that talks specifically about debitage, and which is the raw material waste. So for all of these flake scars that we have here, we end up removing flakes like these right here. These little thin pieces of stone that you could, in theory, make into something to cut with, or you could rework them into a teeny tiny projectile point like this guy right here, originally starting out as a flake. But you end up with all this debitage, right? And you end up with loads and loads more of this debitage than you do of the stone tool. So for every stone tool that you have, you get hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of this debitage. And so what's nice about debitage studies is we are able to look at debitage from the entirety of the archaeological record. Because you can imagine, if you are a prehistoric hunter or prehistoric forager, what have you, you're going to want to take this wherever you're going, right? But this debitage, which comes from the French for trash, this is waste. This is not material that you're going to use. So all of these flakes are typically going to be found either in the same context, or maybe you look at this one and you say, oh, this right here is pretty big, it's pretty thick, I could use that to make another itty bitty tiny projectile point like this one right here. So I'm going to pull this one aside, and this one we can see, although you probably can't tell because my camera is a potato, but on this one we've got teeny tiny flake scars, just like the flake scars on this. And through experimental use wear, which is one of those 4 categories that I talked about, through experimental use wear, so literally taking this and scraping it against a piece of wood, or scraping it against a hide, or even our own skin if we wanted to shave, we can start to look under the microscope and say, this was used to sharpen a hide. So experimental replication of past uses tells us this flake is probably pretty useful for little quick cutting activities and stuff like that. So I'm going to pull that flake aside, and you can start to see how this assemblage of debitage is starting to get picked for all the good stuff. And so what we get left with is all the junk, all the stuff that's not going to be turned into a projectile point, or a smaller projectile point, or maybe a little scraper like this guy right here, or a preform for something else. So we're going to be selecting out a bunch of stuff. And so books like this one by Andrzejewski on lithic debitage talk about how experimental replication allows us to look at the whole process. Because in the archaeological record, we oftentimes just get a projectile point, or we just get a scraper, or we get a preform, or we just get part of the debitage, but we never get the whole picture of the debitage, the point. We don't get what you're seeing here. And so experimental replication allows us to look at the whole process from start, which will be a giant big cobble or boulder, to the end product, the projectile point. And we get to start to look at, well, how do things like the flake size change, or how often are people selecting out debitage for manufacture of secondary stone tools like this little projectile point here, which is kind of hard to see. But how are they selecting out things? And that's one of the benefits of experimental archaeology, is when we don't have the full record, when we just have, say, the projectile points, well, we want to know how they're made. And so we have to look at things like debitage. And so I've already mentioned so far 3 things that we can learn about the past through just doing experimental flint knapping. The first is getting inside the heads of the flint knappers, gives us a better appreciation of how stone tools are made. So then when we're looking at them, we actually know what to look for. So we're not just looking at them and saying, oh, that's some cool notching. Now we can start to say, that notching is actually really well done. Look at the nice flake scar they had there. That's some skill. And the symmetry of the flake removals that we can see along the edge here. Sorry, I'm having to look at a screen to figure out where my pencil is pointing here. This is really well made. It's got nice symmetrical flake scarring, spans the length of the blade. So someone who's done some flint knapping, such as myself, and can only make crud like this, can really start to appreciate, high quality flint knapping versus crummy flint knapping. And you can start to recognize those patterns. So getting inside the minds of the flint knappers, we can start to look at use-wear studies. So we can start to say what they might have used these objects for by looking microscopically along the edges of these stone tools for things like polish, which you can sort of see, the high gloss and luster. That's not really polish, but if we look at it under a microscope, you're going to see different polishes and striations based on, were they cutting, human flesh, or were they cutting, hides? Were they cutting wood? Were they cutting plant materials? And you can start to distinguish stuff through use-wear studies. And then the next one that we want to talk about is sort of, debitage analysis. So looking at the whole picture here. And of course, the last one these make for great museum exhibits. So I can study the real deal while these are out on display for other people to see, or if you're making educational videos like I am right now, they're great for educational purposes. You don't have to worry about damaging the actual artifact. So what I'm going to do now is talk about a short little video explaining, we don't really have the capacity to do experimental archaeology per se at Cuyahoga Community College where I teach, but there are other universities like Kent State, which is nearby to us, that does a lot of experimental archaeology. So I'm going to put my headphones on, and I'm going to listen in with you guys. I guess I don't need my other microphone there. And I'm going to listen in with you guys on this video that talks a little bit about the experimental archaeology lab at Kent State University.
My lab focuses
keep it
on
rolling.
prehistoric and experimental archaeology. We recreate people's past lives based on their material culture, their artifacts, their settlement patterns, and things we dig up out of the ground. But what makes our lab really unique is the focus on what we call experimental archaeology. And when we find an artifact and we want to understand how it works, the best way is to use that artifact. We actually make replica artifacts here. And why that's important is just that we can't use real.
So notice how he is in here. I guess I'll move my head over here so I'm not in the way. Notice how he's got this giant cobble. So that's what I was talking about before. When you take a stone tool like this and you try to manufacture it from a large cobble like Dr. Aaron's got there, you have to start to get into the mind of the flint napper. How do they go from a large cobble like that or nodule and bring it down to a projectile point? You also notice he's got, it's probably hard to see, but he's got some padding on his thigh there because he's literally whacking rocks on his thigh. So he wants to have that protection. So that's something else to keep in mind. Safety goggles. I would probably recommend wearing gloves. He's not wearing gloves, so that's just a precaution I would recommend as well. If you ever decide to get into flint napping, you can make stuff out of glass bottles like I do. But again, it's dangerous stuff, so make sure you're always using protection. And, I guess I'm not necessarily affiliated when I'm making this video with anyone that would tell me no, but I'd probably say work with someone who's done it before. Don't try and do this on your own. Work with someone else who is a skilled and professional or trained flint napper.
Real artifacts in our tests because those are priceless, but the replicas we make are not. And so what we can do is we can make stone arrowheads to fire and break in as many ways as we need. Flint napping is the process of making stone tools through the act of flaking or chipping. There's not a lot of power involved.
So what he's doing right here, and what he's not really explaining, because this is obviously a simple educational video, is he's essentially made a flake. And you'll notice all that debitage that's falling down there. Again, experimental archaeology allows us to look at the entirety of the reduction continuum. So we can look at it from the beginning of the pencil all the way to the end. And, a prehistoric flint napper might look at that and say, oh, that's actually big enough that I could probably make a projectile point out of that flake right there. So they might take that flake and move it elsewhere, and not likely to leave it in the same spot that they started working on that nodule or cobble. So it's telling us something about the formation of the archaeological record by doing experimental archaeology.
Basically, you will strike a piece of flint or chert or obsidian, any rock that breaks like glass. It takes years to become a good flint napper, and myself, I've been flint napping now for about 15 years. But it's really rewarding because once you know how to do it, you can generate the data samples that you need for tests.
And so another thing that he's not necessarily talking about, he's talking about obviously generating data for tests. So, he's generating debitage that can be used in all sorts of different analyses to look at how things change through time. And what's nice about the experimental data is we can then compare the experimental data to the empirical data, what we actually find in the archaeological record, to find out, okay, how are people removing flakes from, their samples? Or, what stuff is missing that we see in the experimental data set where nothing is removed? We have all of it right there and then. What's missing can oftentimes be filled in with experimental data. And, he's using all sorts of interesting things that we could get into if we wanted to talk about the finer details of flint napping, like using, bone hammers, which is, I guess, soft hammer percussion, even though bone's pretty hard, versus hard hammer percussion, which is rocks, all that kind of different stuff. So experimenting with different ways of breaking rocks is stuff that we've learned through experimental flint knapping.
On top of the fact that to be able to walk into a bar and say I make stone weapons is pretty cool. The experimental room in our lab is
I'll counter with, I don't think I've ever been able to get someone to buy me a beer or anything like that when saying I can make stone tools. But granted, I also can't make stone tools like he can. I make little cruddy things like this. But, you know, perks of being an archaeologist, I suppose.
Really unique feature for any archaeology lab, not only in North America, but the world, to have a dedicated room that has a kiln for pottery firing, a pottery wheel, industrial floor for butchery or stone tool making, as well as an entire ballistic setup. Right now we're just firing into a fresh potter's clay, but we could use carcasses. We can fire this at bone to see how strong some of these things are.
So yeah, actually he's bringing up a good point. Some of the early experimental archaeology that was done, say back in the 1970s, was done by, I believe it was George Frizen. I can't remember what his first name is. But it was Dr. Frizen out in, I believe, University of Wyoming. And he literally took Clovis points, replicated them based on the work of Donald Crabtree, and then fired them into bison carcasses to see, how much they penetrated the bison carcass, what happened to the projectile point once it impacted with the carcass. So something that we didn't know before experimental archaeology is, how do we distinguish between a point that's broken from impact with something and something that's broken through impact with, say, a plow in a farm field, which might seem like such a simple question, but it's something that experimental archaeology has allowed us to sort of answer.
Not only can we test weaponry, but we can test the efficiency of knives, we can test how strong pots are. So basically, any aspect of archaeology in the world, we can recreate in the lab and study it right here at Kent State.
So that's the cool stuff about experimental archaeology and all the neat things that you can do just from experimental archaeology, but obviously today we focused on lithics. So hopefully you learned something about stone tools and all the neat things that you can learn from trying to make stone tools. Even if you're not good at it like me, I still can appreciate the process of flint knapping. Even if you can't make gorgeous fluted points, you still start to understand and start thinking like a prehistoric flint knapper would, and that's invaluable to an archaeologist who's studying stone tools, which are, arguably speaking, in North America, the most abundant artifact that you'll run into more than any other. So it behooves us to learn something about stone tool technology pretty much anywhere that we're going in archaeology. So that's going to do it for today's video. I will see you in the next one, and until then, never stop learning.